For the past 2 years, something felt off. Not on the surface, because if you just watched the games, you saw the highlights, the deep threes, the sold-out arenas. But underneath all of that, there was a growing tension that nobody in the league wanted to fully acknowledge. Because while Caitlin Clark was rapidly becoming the biggest draw in women's basketball, it almost felt like the system around her was trying to slow that rise down. You saw it in how the conversations were framed. Instead of fully embracing her impact, the narrative kept getting spread out. It wasn't just her, it was the rookie class. It wasn't just her, it was the league growing naturally. And every time her influence became impossible to ignore, the spotlight seemed to shift somewhere else. But that wasn't the only thing. There's been a lot of buzz online, with fans pointing out moments where Clark appeared to take excessive physical play, some even calling it unnecessary or targeted. Now, to be fair, that's part of the game. Basketball is physical, but the conversation didn't stop there. Because many started asking a bigger question. Why did it feel like nobody at the top was stepping in? League executives stayed quiet, public responses were minimal, and for months, it felt like the people in charge were choosing not to fully engage with what was happening right in front of everyone. And then something changed. Almost overnight, the same voices that had been silent started speaking. Executives reappeared, narratives shifted, and suddenly, the tone around the league felt very different. Not gradual, not natural, but fast. And that's what caught people's attention. Because shifts like that don't just happen for no reason. They happen when something forces them to happen. And what just played out on national television? It may have revealed exactly what that reason was. And this is where things start to feel different. Because for months, the league felt quiet, not literally, but strategically. Conversations were controlled, responses were measured, and most importantly, the people at the very top seemed almost invisible. Executives weren't speaking much. Public appearances were limited. Even on social media, there was a noticeable absence. It was like the league was moving forward, but without really addressing the biggest storyline unfolding right in front of everyone. And that storyline, of course, centered around Caitlin Clark. But then, almost overnight, that silence disappeared. Suddenly, executives started stepping in front of microphones, interviews started popping up, statements were being made, and the same voices that had been quiet for months were now actively shaping the conversation. That kind of shift doesn't just happen randomly. It usually means one thing: something forced it. Now, what exactly caused that shift? That's where things get interesting. Because from the outside, it looks like a reaction, not a plan. There's been a lot of speculation online, with fans suggesting that the league may have underestimated just how big this moment was becoming. Some believe the growing attention, the debates, and the constant spotlight created pressure that couldn't be ignored anymore. Others think it goes deeper than that. They point to the timing, the sudden reappearance of leadership, the coordinated messaging, and they start asking whether this was an attempt to regain control of a narrative that was starting to slip away. Because once the public starts forming its own conclusions, it becomes much harder to guide the story. And that's exactly what it felt like was happening. The conversation was no longer being led from the top. It was being driven by fans, media clips, and viral moments. And when that happens, organizations don't stay silent for long. They respond quickly. But here, the key detail that makes this shift stand out. It didn't feel gradual. It felt urgent. And urgency usually means one thing: there's more going on behind the scenes than what's being said publicly. Which leads to the next question. What exactly triggered that urgency in the first place? And then this dropped. Out of nowhere, the Indiana Fever announced plans for a massive $78 million practice facility, a state-of-the-art performance center elite training environment, a vision for the future. On the surface, it sounds impressive. But if you stop and really think about it, it raises a much bigger question. Where did that money come from? Because not that long ago, the Indiana Fever weren't exactly a powerhouse organization. They weren't dominating the league. They weren't selling out arenas. In fact, reports and past trends suggest they were struggling to generate consistent attention, let alone massive revenue. So how does a team go from that to suddenly investing tens of millions into infrastructure? That kind of leap doesn't happen slowly. It happens when something shifts. And the timing here, it's impossible to ignore. This project didn't appear 5 years ago. It didn't show up during a random rebuilding phase. It arrived right after one of the most talked about players in basketball joined the team, Caitlin Clark. Now, to be clear, there's no official statement saying this facility exists because of her. No executive is going to come out and say that directly. But there's been a lot of buzz around this, with fans and analysts pointing out how closely the timeline lines up. And when you connect those dots, it starts to look less like coincidence. Because since Clark's arrival, everything changed. Ticket demand skyrocketed, arenas started filling up, national attention exploded, broadcast deals gained more value, and suddenly, the Fever weren't just another team, they were at the center of the conversation. That kind of impact doesn't just boost visibility. It generates money. Real money. And that's what makes this $78 million project so interesting. Because instead of just being a facility, it starts to look like evidence, a physical sign that something major shifted behind the scenes. And once you start viewing it that way, you begin to realize this isn't just about basketball anymore. It's about economics and who's really driving it. And this is where the story goes from interesting to undeniable. Because once you start looking at the numbers, the timelines, and the overall attention around the league, one name keeps showing up at the center of it all: Caitlin Clark. Almost immediately after she entered the WNBA, everything shifted. Ticket sales didn't just increase, they exploded. Teams that normally played in smaller venues suddenly had to move games to larger arenas just to handle the demand. We're talking about sellouts in 15,000 to 18,000 seat venues on a consistent basis. That's not normal for the WNBA, that's new. And it didn't stop there. Broadcast numbers surged. National networks started paying more attention. Games that would have gone unnoticed were now being promoted, discussed, and analyzed across major platforms. And with that kind of exposure comes something even more important: advertising money. Real money. There's been a lot of discussion around this, with reports suggesting that Clark's presence has significantly boosted viewership and overall league visibility. Now, no single player controls an entire market, but in this case, it's hard to ignore how directly everything lines up with her arrival. And that's what makes this moment different. Because this isn't just about highlights or performance. This is about economic impact. You're seeing merchandise sales spike. You're seeing road games turn into major events. You're seeing opposing teams benefit financially just from her showing up in their arena. That's not typical for a rookie. That's something you usually associate with global-level stars. And even then, this feels bigger. Because it's not just one team benefiting. It's the entire league. Which leads to a very uncomfortable question for some people. If one player is driving this much revenue, this much attention, and this much growth, how much influence do they actually have? Because at a certain point, impact turns into leverage. And leverage changes everything. And once that becomes clear, it starts to explain why the tone around the league is beginning to shift fast. But here, where things start to get uncomfortable. Because while all of this growth is happening, the sold-out arenas, the rising TV numbers, the massive investments, there's a noticeable pattern in how it's being talked about publicly. And it doesn't always match what people are seeing. Instead of clearly pointing to Caitlin Clark as the driving force behind this surge, the messaging often feels spread out, broader, more controlled. You'll hear phrases like league-wide growth or the strength of the entire rookie class. And while those things may be partially true, they don't fully explain the scale or speed of what's happening right now. Because this kind of jump, it's not gradual, it's not balanced, it's concentrated. And that's what makes the situation so interesting. There's been a lot of discussion online, with fans pointing out what they see as a disconnect between reality and messaging. Some believe the league is intentionally trying to distribute credit to avoid relying too heavily on one player. Others think it's about maintaining a certain image, keeping things equal, keeping things controlled. Now, to be fair, leagues often do this. No organization wants to appear dependent on a single star. It creates risk, it shifts leverage, and it can change the balance of power in ways that are hard to manage. But here's the problem. The free market doesn't really care about messaging. It responds to results. And right now, the results are pointing in a very specific direction. You can see it in ticket demand. You can see it in viewership spikes. You can see it in the way entire arenas react when Clark steps on the floor. That kind of impact is hard to redistribute, no matter how the narrative is framed. So when the front office celebrates major investments, when the league highlights its growth, but avoids directly connecting those outcomes to the most obvious catalyst, people notice. And once people start noticing, they start asking questions. Because this isn't just about giving credit. It's about control. Control of the narrative, control of perception, and ultimately, control of who holds the real influence in the league. And if that control starts to slip, that's when things really begin to change. But this isn't where the tension stops, because now the spotlight starts shifting inside the organization itself. And one name keeps coming up in that conversation: Stephanie White. There's been growing discussion around her role, and more specifically, how she's balancing it. Because while she's leading a team that suddenly finds itself at the center of the basketball world, she's also been involved in media and broadcasting work at the same time. Now, to be fair, this isn't unheard of. Coaches and analysts often wear multiple hats, but in this situation, the timing is what's raising eyebrows. Because this isn't a normal season. This is a moment where the Indiana Fever are under more pressure, more attention, and more opportunity than they've had in years. And when that kind of spotlight hits, every decision, on and off the court, gets magnified. There's been a lot of buzz around this, with some critics suggesting that splitting focus during such a critical period could impact preparation, strategy, and overall team development. Others, however, believe that her experience in multiple roles actually adds value, giving her a broader perspective on the game. So the opinions are divided. But the conversation doesn't stop there. Some have also pointed back to her previous coaching record at the collegiate level, bringing up past struggles as part of a larger debate about whether she's the right fit for a team built around a player like Caitlin Clark. Now again, it's important to be clear, past performance doesn't always define future results. Coaches evolve, systems change. But when expectations rise this quickly, every detail gets examined. And that's exactly what's happening here. Because this isn't just about coaching anymore. It's about alignment. Does the system match the player? Does the strategy match the moment? And more importantly, does the leadership match the level of opportunity in front of them? Because when you have a player driving this much attention, this much growth, and this much pressure, there's very little room for uncertainty. And if there is uncertainty, It doesn't stay quiet for long. But here, where the conversation shifts from players and teams to something much bigger. Because this isn't just about one franchise or one star anymore. This is about the direction of the entire league. Recently, Kathy Engelbert and league officials have been openly discussing major structural changes, new salary cap increases, expanded investment, and most importantly, a longer season. And on paper, it all sounds like progress. More games, more money, more exposure. But when you look closer, it starts to feel a lot more calculated. Because expanding the schedule to something as demanding as 50-plus games isn't just a small adjustment. That's a completely different level of physical and financial commitment. It changes how teams are built. It changes how players perform. And most importantly, it changes what kind of player actually succeeds in this system. Now here, where it gets interesting. There's been a lot of speculation around this, with some analysts suggesting that these changes aren't just about growth, they're about sustainability. In other words, making sure the business side of the league continues to thrive without sacrificing profitability for ownership groups. And that's key. Because while the public narrative focuses on player benefits and league expansion, the underlying goal often comes down to balance. How do you grow the league while still protecting the financial interests behind it? So what do? You create a system that demands more output. More games means more content. More content means more broadcast value. And more broadcast value means stronger deals with networks and sponsors. But there's a trade-off. A longer, more intense season puts pressure on players, physically and strategically. It favors depth, endurance, and efficiency over isolation-heavy styles or slower-paced systems. And that's not random. That's design. Because when a league evolves like this, it's not just reacting, it's shaping the future of how the game is played. And once you start looking at it from that angle, you realize this isn't just about expansion. It's about control. Control of the product, control of the pace, and ultimately, control of what kind of basketball defines the next era. And that raises a very important question. Who benefits the most from that kind of system? And this is where everything starts to click. Because when you really break down the direction the league is heading, the faster pace, the longer season, the emphasis on endurance, you start to notice something. This system isn't built for everyone. It favors a very specific type of player. And that player looks a lot like Caitlin Clark. Think about it. A longer season means more games, more travel, and more physical wear over time. That kind of environment doesn't reward players who rely heavily on isolation or physical dominance alone. It rewards efficiency, conditioning, decision-making speed. And that's exactly where Clark stands out. She doesn't just play fast, she processes the game fast. Her ability to push tempo, create shots in transition, and stretch defenses with deep range becomes even more dangerous when opponents start to fatigue. Over time, that gap only widens. There's been growing discussion around this, with analysts pointing out how a high-tempo system naturally amplifies players who can maintain energy and execution deep into games. And Clark has already shown she can handle heavy minutes without a noticeable drop in performance. That matters, because in a 50-plus game season, consistency becomes more valuable than flashes. And then there's spacing. The modern game is shifting toward perimeter shooting, quick ball movement, and transition offense. Slower, more physical styles don't disappear, but they become harder to sustain over long stretches. And when defenses are forced to cover more ground, players who can shoot from deep and create instantly become even more valuable. Again, that plays directly into Clark's strengths. But here's the bigger picture. This isn't just about skill, it's about adaptation. The league is evolving, whether intentionally or not, toward a faster, more efficient style of play. and players who can't keep up with that shift, they're going to struggle to maintain the same level of impact. That's just the reality of it. So when you look at the new structure, the new pace, and the new demands, it doesn't just highlight Clark's abilities, it amplifies them. And once that becomes clear, you start to understand why this moment feels less like coincidence and more like the beginning of a completely new era. And then it finally happened. After months of careful messaging, controlled narratives, and what many saw as a reluctance to fully acknowledge the obvious, Kathy Engelbert stepped in front of a national audience and said something that completely changed the tone. At first, it sounded routine. She talked about growth, investment, the future of the league, the new structure, the expanded schedule, the rising opportunities, everything you'd expect from a commissioner addressing progress. But then she said it. She directly acknowledged the impact of Caitlin Clark. Not vaguely, not indirectly, clearly. And that moment stood out. Because for a long time, the messaging had been different. The focus was spread across the league. The credit was shared. The narrative stayed balanced. But now, in a single statement, that balance shifted. Clark wasn't just part of the growth anymore. She was central to it. Now, to be fair, this wasn't framed as a complete reversal. It wasn't presented as an admission of being wrong, but the change in tone was obvious, and people noticed immediately. There's been a lot of buzz around this moment, with fans pointing out how different it felt compared to previous comments. Some believe it was simply the result of undeniable numbers, viewership, attendance, revenue, all becoming too big to ignore. Others think it was something else, a recognition that the narrative had already moved beyond control. Because once the public, the media, and the market all start aligning around the same conclusion, it becomes harder to maintain a different version of the story. And that's what this felt like. Not just a statement, but an adjustment, a shift toward reality. Because at this point, the impact is no longer subtle. It's visible, measurable, and increasingly impossible to downplay. And when the commissioner of the league acknowledges that, even in a measured way, it sends a message, not just to fans, but to teams, to players, to everyone involved. The game is changing, and the center of that change, it's no longer up for debate. So when you step back and look at everything, the money, the messaging, the sudden shift in tone, it starts to become very clear. This was never just about basketball. What we're watching right now is a power shift. For years, leagues have controlled the narrative. They decided how stories were told, who got credit, and how the spotlight was distributed. But in this case, that control started to slip. Because the impact of Caitlin Clark became too big to manage quietly. You can't hide sold-out arenas. You can't downplay record-breaking viewership. And you definitely can't ignore the kind of economic wave that forces teams to invest tens of millions almost overnight. At some point, reality catches up. And that's exactly what just happened. The commissioner acknowledging it, the sudden media appearances, the shift in messaging, none of that feels accidental. It feels like a response to something that could no longer be contained. Now, to be fair, this doesn't mean the league is losing control completely. But it does mean the balance is changing. Because when one player begins to influence revenue, attention, and even structural decisions, that's no longer just a star. That's leverage. And leverage changes how decisions get made. It changes how teams build. It changes how the league markets itself. And most importantly, it changes who really drives the future of the sport. But here's the bigger question. What happens next? Because moments like this don't just fade away. They set the tone for what comes after. Either the league adapts and builds around this new reality, or it risks falling behind it. And based on everything we've seen so far, adaptation is already happening. Quietly, quickly, and maybe a little reluctantly. Because whether people want to admit it or not, the game has changed. And this time, everyone saw it happen in real time.